Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us on this webinar on the future of medical publishing, why open access matters. My name's Paul Lavender. I'm the head of education at Karga Publishers, a Swiss-based publisher of medical books and journals, and I'm joined by my colleague, Beth Bailey. Beth has spent many years diving into the field of open access, and the aim of this webinar is to guide you through some of the complexities of what can be a very very complex field, even for people who work in the publishing industry like myself. So during this webinar, we'll give a quick introduction to Karga Publishers. We'll give an overview of open access, what it is, some of the trends and the developments in the market, and most importantly, we're assuming that there are a lot of research authors on this call and that you would like some kind of checklist of practical considerations, what you need to think about when you submit your paper. And please do at any point put questions into the chat, type them in, and we'd love to be able to come to those at the end and address some practical questions that you have. So a little bit about Karga Publishers before I hand over to Beth. Karga is a family-owned company and has been since founded in 1890. You can see from the slide, most of our team are based in Switzerland, but actually nearly half are scattered throughout the world, including North America, LATAM, China, India, Australia, and the Middle East. We offer a scope of publishing services. We offer traditional health science journals. You can see a selection here of some of our most popular and oldest, like the cytology, dermatology, audiology, and neurology. We have about 100 journals. We have 9,000 available book titles in medical science, covering 25 subject areas. In addition to the traditional journal and book offering, we also offer medical handbooks, e-learning courses, podcasts, summary sheets to healthcare practitioners and to patients. And not only do we offer the journals, the handbooks, the courses, but we also now offer extended science communication and outreach services. So using small animations, podcasts, websites, video abstracts to increase the outreach of scientific research and expand the audience of our authors' work. So that's who we are. And now what we'd like to do is give you an introduction to open access. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Beth.
Yes. Hi, thanks, Paul. So open access can seem like a bit of a wild ride. As Paul said, it can get a bit, it can look a bit overwhelming, a bit confusing, but there are really wonderful benefits, and there are people who have been fighting to make it the standard for decades. So there's a lot a lot of major benefit, but there can also be some serious pitfalls. And I think as an author, when you publish, one of the reasons is to benefit your career, and you can actually end up hurting it if you don't make informed and careful choices. So we want to kind of give you the background that you need so that you can make good choices and let you know like what the benefits are of open access, how you can identify the pitfalls, and how to make the choices that are right for you and your paper. Can you go ahead, please, Paul? Thanks. So here's kind of the proof. Open access can be a bit crazy making. There's a lot of terminology, and even after these like at least 2-3 decades, people are still actively debating over what the terms mean, and sometimes new ones come along. But our goal here is not for you to sort of have all of this memorized by the end of the session. We just want you to have heard it, become a bit familiar with it, get an idea of what, which of these might be important for you, and where you can find information about these things. So I will go quickly through the list, but again, don't panic if we won't give you a quiz after. You don't have to have everything down by the end. So I'll start with green open access. Now, before open access started to come into the mainstream, the major model for seeing journals was subscription, where an individual or maybe a research library would pay for a subscription, and that gives everybody access to read the content. With green open access, you can make a paper openly available by putting it in a repository, even though the original article might still be behind a paywall under the subscription model. This can be done by the author, put in the repository, or sometimes the institution, someone from the library will do it. Often it's not the version of record, but the manuscript version that will go in the repository, and then the version of record might stay behind the paywall. And sometimes there's also an embargo. So the manuscript that's in the repository might not be available for everybody to read in the open repository until a year after the article is published. Self-archiving is basically the verb for doing green open access. So when you as the author, or perhaps you're a librarian or somebody, puts the whichever version of the article in the repository, that's called self-archiving. So yeah, that's something that you're very likely to see in journal guidelines and in other sources that are talking about open access and author and policies that affect authors. Now, gold open access is sort of the gold standard, if you will, for open access. And this is probably what people are thinking of really when they talk about open access. This is when an article is fully open access at the source where it's published in the journal. It's permanently open access. There are other conditions to it that give reuse rights, which is not always the case with green open access. And very often with gold open access, most often it involves paying an article processing charge. And that may be paid by the author, or it could be paid by their research funder, or sometimes by the institution. And we'll talk a bit more about those. Diamond open access is something else you might hear, especially if you sort of follow news about like the big picture of scholarly communications. It's gaining steam, but also has some challenges. But what it means is that an organization covers all the costs. So there might be an institution or a society or a government body that covers all the costs of the journals. So it's open access for reading. And also there's no APC for publishing in it. Subscribe to Open is another up-and-comer. It's a new model because the ideal with open access is everybody can read the content, can read the articles, but when you add an article processing charge that can average $3,000, maybe sometimes more, then that puts another barrier up because not everybody can then afford to publish. So Subscribe to Open is a new model that's attempting to solve that. And it's basically under the old subscription model, but if a certain amount of subscription renewals are reached that allows the publisher to cover costs, then that year of the journal is open access. So it's a bit complicated, but it does solve the problem of giving fees for authors to publish open access. Yeah, and we are one of the publishers who's trialing it. We have 4 journals right now trying Subscribe to Open, and we'll see if it works, but it would be great to have, yeah, no fees for reading or publishing. Hybrid journals, you're very likely to encounter. Those are subscription journals, but you have an option to pay to publish individual articles as open access. Directory of open access journals, something you might hear in this world of open access, and we'll come back to it later. But yeah, it's kind of a whitelist of what journals might be most trustworthy to submit to, and I'll go into more detail on why you need a whitelist later. Transformative agreements, also as an author, good to pay attention to this because it's like a subscription in that the research institution or university covers the subscription cost, but in addition, this agreement covers the costs of open access publishing for the authors. So if you want to publish in a journal and you want your paper to be open access, then it's very good to see if you are eligible for one. And then this is really important. the funder mandate or institutional mandate for open access. Some funders have as a condition for a grant, or also some institutions require authors to publish under certain conditions for open access. It might be green open access, and they might say you can have an embargo of 12 months, or you can't have an embargo. They might say it must be fully open access with a certain license or not. So this is something that you really want to check. You want to see what is required of you, and you want to make sure that the journal allows you to meet those requirements. Lots of good resources on the internet. You can find explainers on YouTube, but also we have a webpage, cargo.com/open access, that has just some explainers as well. And you can also write to our openaccess@cargo.com email anytime if you have questions. And I take turns managing that email address, so you can send questions directly to me about anything. Can you go ahead, please, Paula? Thanks. So why does open access matter? Why, if it's so much trouble and so confusing, why do we care so much about it? Why is it so important? And again, to remind you, kind of the gold standard in open access is that articles should be free for everybody to read permanently. They're permitted to share, and they allow reuse, and the type of reuse depends on the license, which we'll talk more about later. So these are some of the benefits for you, especially as an author, but also globally. Faster dissemination of your paper. So an open access article might be published on the same day as a subscription article, but if there are paywalls and barriers, it can't travel as fast or as easily. Higher visibility. So you definitely, well, studies show that authors definitely get more eyes on their papers when they're published open access. There is, I think, not full clarity on whether you also get more citations. There are some studies that have shown that you do get more citations with open access, some that show not necessarily, and that might be because the wider audience can include people who aren't academics who cite papers in that way. It can be that it now could reach more practitioners or patients in the public or policymakers in the government who might not write a paper as such and cite it, but still this all leads to like real world impact, and that is greater when you publish open access. Global equity, that's one of the underlying ideals of open access. And it's one of the reasons that we try different models, like I mentioned, the subscribe to open or diamond or gold. We're trying different ways so that really everybody has a chance to share the knowledge that they're working on, as well as to access it, because that can make a difference to lives around the world. With open access, also, most journals allow the authors to retain the copyright. And again, so these mandates are really important for authors. And if you publish your article as open access, then you can, kind of rest assured that you're going to be able to meet your mandate most likely. You have to, confirm the details, but yeah, it's the easiest way to address that. Can you go ahead, please, Paul? Thanks. So this is another one that might look a little bit overwhelming at first, but again, you don't have to have this memorized. You should just, at the end of this session, have an idea of, why these are important and where to find the information and, what you need to check for. You don't have to memorize this entire chart. Creative Commons licenses are those licenses that we said dictate in what ways an article can be reused or any kind of work by a creator. So they are public licenses by this not-for-profit organization called Creative Commons, and usually we just say CC instead of Creative Commons. The licenses are layered over copyright, so they don't replace copyright. And yeah, they say what conditions articles can be shared under or reused. So you might find that in your open access mandate, your institution or your funder might say you have to use a certain license. And then you have to make sure that the journal you find lets you use that license. You might have journals that give you a choice of licenses, and you might have journals that say you have to use a certain license for your open access content. So you want to make sure before you submit that you can meet your grant conditions or your institution's mandate, or that if you don't have a mandate, that you yourself are happy with the conditions your article will be published under. And to kind of decode what these mean, the SA, I'll start with, is share alike, and that means you have to use the same license when you reuse it. And I really see that less. It's not terribly common, but we'll start with the by. So the first one, CC by. And the by, to decode that, it basically means you have to say who the work is by. You have to attribute the article to the original author and publisher. The ND is for no derivatives. And if there's an ND, that means your work can't be shared, or any work that you're using. I'm sorry, not shared, adapted, no derivatives. So no creating derivative works or changing it. So, if there's an ND, you can't make a musical version, or you can't, take excerpts, you can't translate it, you can't change it without getting permission. And the NC stands for non-commercial. So if there's an NC on the license, that means that that work cannot be used for commercial purposes. So yeah, CC BY is considered the gold standard. It's the one that most funders and institutions would like authors to use or are requiring, and it's the one that's most aligned with open science principles. And the benefit of CC BY is that there are no barriers for reusing the work as long as there's attribution given. Then anybody can use your work and build on it and take it further. On the other hand, it also is really like completely unrestricted, and somebody can also adapt it in a way that you as the author don't agree with. They can put it in an anthology and sell it on Amazon, or they can make money from it, and they might do things that you don't agree with. So, and in addition, because the attribution is required, your name will still be on it. So these are things you need to weigh. You may or may not actually have a choice of what license you can publish under. But yeah, that's something, if you do have that choice, you want to be aware, and consider what matters to you, what your priorities are. So, thanks, Paul. Back to you.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you. So that was an overview of the kind of the licensing and the types of open access that are available. And what we'll look at now is the adoption of open access, just a little, but more broadly, the ecosystem that open access is part of. Open access is not something that exists in isolation, but it's part of a wider movement of open science. So how is open access doing? What we're seeing in a nutshell is slowing but growing. So towards the turn of the 2000, there was open access articles were in a minority, a large minority, and each year more and more articles are published under an open access license. That's still the case, but the rate is slowing down. And around 2023, you can see about 50% of all scholarly articles were paid for open access in 2023. So this has been a huge sea change in how science is published and communicated. Now, there are think tanks, congresses discussing why has there been a slowdown now in open access. And the particular report that we're looking at for this slide would has pointed to some issues with quality, because when an article is published in an open access journal, it can be easier for the authors to publish than it may be in a journal that is not open access and relies very much on scientific impact, and that publishers are trying to sell this material through subscriptions onto librarians. So this has led to a bit of an emphasis on research integrity, and that open access publishers need to be particularly careful about the quality of the work that they accept for publication. But despite these concerns, the desire for open access is clearly there. The advantages that Beth mentioned are very clear to readers, to be able to go to an article and not meet a paywall or any kind of barrier to reading. And so its benefits are still there, and it is still growing, and we expect this to be the dominant model. As I said, it's not simply open access, but open access is one part of open science. And one of the clearest definitions we've had of what open science means in a practical sense is the European guidelines and the ambitions of the European community. So they've defined their open science ambitions in 8 points. Open data, so data that's freely accessible, interoperable, reproducible, and replicable should be the default method of publishing data. The open science cloud, so there's a platform to allow the sharing of this open data across borders and across fields. That there should be a new generation of matrix to track the importance, the relevance, the quality, and the impact of the data that are published. So beyond the impact factor, that they see a future where all science is published is open and available to be accessed easily. And not only just that, but encouraged. And that particularly applies to rewards, that researchers who are publishing under an open access model should be rewarded for doing so in their career, advancement and development and grant funding. That the research published should have a great deal of integrity and agree to common standards of research integrity, and that means ethics and accountability of the findings and the interpretation. Moreover, there should not just be this in place, but there should be education for scientists on how to create this environment of open science, where open access is a part of, but open science can also include things like open data, open lab notes, open peer review. The whole scientific ecosystem is open for analysis and scrutiny and sharing, and to be able to stand on each other's work easily without hindrance. And the last point shows that this open environment goes beyond the scientific community, but extends then to members of the public and citizen science. So where amateurs, so people who are not doing this as a job, are able and encouraged to share their findings of any experiments that they run and their interpretations. And obviously, there are some fields where this is more relevant than others, and amateur astronomers make huge contributions to the field there, for example. So if I go back just 1 second to the fully open future and the ease of accessing data, we say about all peer-reviewed publications should be freely accessible, and the early sharing of different kind of outputs should be encouraged, so before peer review. And a paper that is published online before submission to a journal for peer review is called a preprint. The most common servers in biomedicine will be medRxiv and bioRxiv. And preprints are very useful. They're intended to give the authors a place to upload their work and gather comments from their peers before formal peer review. It also establishes them as authors of the work. So whereas previously maybe two research groups were struggling to reach publication first as they're evaluating the same topic or the same experiment, and one may, for example, may submit first but be delayed by peer review in a certain journal, and the other may beat them even though they submitted later. Preprint removes that race. When the data are ready and the paper's ready, it can be uploaded to a preprint server and authorship is established. So this is one example of open science, that these papers on preprint servers are accessible to everybody. And this advantage of open science, that it allows you to gather feedback early from peers, it allows you to establish authorship, also has the double-edged sword, or the problems, that because it's accessible to everybody, data and preprints can be misinterpreted. So we had one example with COVID. So this was a preprint about the coronavirus, and the authors of the preprint pointed out the similarities of the coronavirus to the HIV virus. And this was published as a preprint, and peers came on and they said, no, this is not good science. The similarities being pointed out are similar to all viruses. There is nothing special to link corona to HIV. However, journalists and media had got hold of that study and run with it. So the story had already started to disseminate. And at one point, that actually became the highest impact story as measured by Altmatrix, the highest impact scientific publication as measured by Altmatrix on the internet, surpassing all major publications like Obama's climate change article. And the paper was, of course, later withdrawn and taken down from bioRxiv. So one piece of advice that we would offer is that although when writing a paper, citing preprints is now far more acceptable than it was, although there were some funders that did not want to do this or allow any work that they funded to cite preprints. It's now acceptable, it's now common practice, but do go back to cite the version of record as soon as the publication is accepted and appears in a peer-reviewed journal. And wherever possible, it's the version of record that should be cited, particularly if there's any errata or corrections, that's where they will appear. So I'd like to that's the wider environment, the ecosystem around open science and where open access is a part of. What I'd like to do now is hand you back to Beth to discuss some practical considerations for authors who want to submit a paper.
Yes, thanks. You could go ahead to the next slide, please. Thanks. So this is already a bit of a review of what we talked about in the first part, but so with open access, these are some of the essential things that you as an author should understand, that you need to know, more about, that you need to look into. And you can think of it this way: as an author, you have rights that the publisher should fulfill, and also you have responsibilities. So things, again, that you want to make sure you're informed about before you submit are if you are subject to a mandate for open access from your funder or from your institution. Check what the publisher's policies are about copyright. And sometimes that is also stipulated in an open access mandate. Some open access mandates will say that you must keep copyright and the publisher should not keep copyright. The Creative Commons license or CC license, you want to check which licenses your journal uses or will allow you to use, and if you're required to publish under a certain one. If not published as gold open access, what are the self-archiving policies of the publisher? And then for open access funding for the APC, that's the article processing charge. And we said this is usually paid by the author, or sometimes the funder will cover the cost. So $3,000 can be a lot. It might, for some authors, it might be money that they don't have. It can be more than their monthly salary in some parts of the world. And then, in other parts of the world, you might have a tight budget, and you might really prefer to hire someone else for your lab or to get new equipment or anything else, but paying $3,000 or $5,000 to pay for open access. So there are ways that you might be able to get it covered, and it's worth checking. If you do have a grant, you can check and see if the costs of open access are covered. Whether or not there is a mandate, sometimes those costs might also be paid. Some authors are eligible for waivers or discounts of the APCs, and like many publishers do, and we do as well, for certain countries with lower incomes, those authors automatically receive a discount or a waiver. But we also understand that worldwide, anywhere, it can be a challenge to cover the cost of an APC. So, if you aren't eligible for some other means to pay for it, and you really, really can't, and you really want to make your article open access, it can be worth it to send an email to the publisher, because many publishers can give discretionary waivers or discounts on a case-by-case basis. So, if all your other options run out, it can be worth asking. But also, it's really worth checking if you are covered under an institutional agreement, or what we call a transformative agreement. And those are the ones where the institution covers the reading costs, like subscription, as well as the costs for their authors to publish open access. So, and also, it's not here, but some libraries have a fund, a special fund, just to cover APCs for their authors. So that's something else you might want to check on. Apart from checking with the policies of your funding body or your institution, you should check carefully the journal guidelines for all the journal's policies and publisher policies. But another really useful source can be the Sherpa services. JISC is an organization in the UK, and they have these services that can be really useful for authors also outside the UK. Probably the most useful one is Sherpa Romeo, which you can also access under the overall page with this link. And Sherpa Romeo lists the open access related and self-archiving policies of different publishers. So that can be a place to check even before you narrow down where you're submitting. And then they have two other pages, Sherpa Fact and Sherpa Juliet, that break down funder policies. So of not all of them in the world, because there are probably many thousands, but at least of some of the major research funders. So yeah, that's handy. Can you go ahead, please, Paul? All right, so we mentioned some pitfalls. Now, in the old days, subscription, under the subscription model, there was pretty much one price, more or less, that a publisher would get from a subscription. It didn't really matter if they published a few more or fewer articles. It was the same. And then along came the open access model with APCs. And what this means is that the more papers that a publisher publishes, the more money they can earn. There has been criticism with some more mainstream publishers that grew rapidly under this model, publishing a lot of special issues, and there are concerns that focus on quality, was kind of diminished under the model. But really, like every mainstream reputable publisher should at least practice the basics of real publishing. But what you have with this model is, and the possibility to just earn money the more papers you publish, is you have some companies that aren't really publishing, except under the lowest definition of, just putting an article online. So they don't provide any of those services that really go with proper publishing. They don't provide peer review. They don't edit. So they will, yes, slap your paper on a website, but it's not what you really want from publishing, and that allows them to just earn money and take advantage of authors. They are known for using aggressive tactics like spamming. They often also are selling conferences that are known as predatory conferences that are not really legitimate, but they can make a lot of money that way. And the problem is that they thrive in the publish or perish culture. So authors are under immense pressure sometimes to publish. So it's kind of understandable, if it can take a while for a paper to go through peer review, or maybe it's rejected, and it can be difficult, and yet they're under all this pressure to publish. So I think you can kind of see where the temptation could come in to publish in one of these journals. It can be difficult to recognize which are the predatory journals, but we're going to talk about that more in a few minutes. Yeah, and it's unfortunate because research integrity is incredibly important. The public's trust in science has waned, and this just contributes to it if there's more kind of junk out there. So can you go ahead, please, Paul? Thanks. So we have a few fun examples of predatory publishing. This one is from 2013, really interesting article you can check out in Science. So it's 11 years old, but I'm afraid it's probably still quite relevant. So this author submitted a paper to 304 open access journals, and it did look like a real paper, but he said like a serious peer reviewer would recognize the flaws, within a couple minutes. So most of the mistakes were really obvious things, and over half of the journals did accept the paper. So yeah, again, if you're interested, you can check out that paper, and there's a bunch of interviews and podcasts with this author, because it was quite talked about quite a bit then. Can you go ahead, please, Paul? And this one is, wow, even more shocking. So the other one looked, at first glance like a genuine research paper that could be published. In this case, there are two authors. I mentioned those like aggressive tactics where the predatory publishers are going after authors, and wearing them down. So these guys were sick of it, and they wanted to get off the mailing list, and they put that request in the form of a research paper, but it's clearly not one you'd probably learn much from. Yeah, and it was accepted. So I mean, that's the basis proof that there are these organizations, these businesses who are just trying to make money, and they don't care at all about the science. So You can go ahead, please. So yeah, why, what's so bad about the predatory publishers? As we said, there is this pressure to publish. So, why not? Well, it can actually be really damaging to your reputation. And one of the things you're probably trying to do when you're publishing a paper is, authors want to build their reputation and, show the excellent work they can do and, advance their careers. The opposite is likely to happen if someone publishes in a predatory journal. These journals probably are not listed in the major databases. If they are very likely, to be found out and to be deselected. So, there's no impact factor, and impact factor shouldn't be the be all end all, but in reality, it often is important to authors and to institutions. And, as someone who's publishing with a predatory publisher is just keeping these things going. They're giving them money and allowing this practice, to continue. And we'd rather take stand against it and put an end to it. And again, citations is something that, might be that authors might aspire to, and you're not likely to get citations and yeah, all the advantages of publishing in a trustworthy journal. And then if we want to avoid these, the next question is, how do we avoid them? So I'll go into some more details, but just a few things. First and foremost, look for journals that are listed in those databases, the major databases. Check, for best practices and various quality plans of journals. So, that's a way to feel more reassured. As well, if your journal that you're submitting to is listed in those databases, it also means it will be found. You want your research that's published to be, found by others in your, by peers. Look for things like bad grammar, claims that just sound very dodgy and unlikely. Those can be signs in an email that you might receive. Check whitelists. I mentioned the Directory of Open Access Journals, or DOAJ, and that's a not-for-profit organization supported by sponsorship that has a very rigorous check of journals that they index. They must follow various best practices, have transparent policies and different factors. So that can be a way to get more reassurance that this is a journal you can feel safe submitting to. And a really good website here is thinkchecksubmit.org, and they kind of talk you through some of the points to check. Can you please go ahead, Paul? So this was a fun one. At one point, Paul and I were talking about some slides about predatory journals, and I got this beauty in my inbox. So, there are a few things stand out. Like here, they list 2 different impact factors. So right there, within a few line spaces on their homepage, they already have bad information or incorrect information. So, that's one red flag. Can you go ahead, please, Paul? And this impact factor, which is actually relatively high, depending on how you look at things, they say it was issued by the Scientific Journal Impact Factor Organization of Morocco. And to be sure, the impact factor organization is not called that, and it's not based in Morocco. So, that's just another red flag. Yeah, so sometimes it can be really difficult. I think some of the predatory publishers have very polished pages. Sometimes they use journal titles that are almost identical to real journal titles. Sometimes they just take names from editorial board members they see at other journals and put them on their own list of editorial board members. So it can be tricky, but there are also sometimes these things that are that can jump out at you if you know to look for them. Go forward, please. Yeah, and Think, Check, Submit is the website we mentioned. That's definitely, it can be your friend. And they have a checklist. Can you go forward again, please, Paul? They have a lot of good information, but they also have the checklist. So yeah, do you or your colleagues know the journal? That's something you can look into. Can you see, who and where the publisher is, just like any other business? If you wouldn't want to send them your money if you can't tell who they are and how you can contact them. Is the journal clear about policies, like the type of peer review it uses? Again, our article is indexed in services that you use to find papers. Are the fees that they will charge clear? Do you recognize anyone in the editorial board? And is the publisher a member of a trusted industry organization like the DOAJ, or another one is the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, and they also have a rigorous vetting process to make sure that publishers who are part of it are transparent and open and fair and editorial best practices and peer review and things like that. So can you go forward, please, Paul? I think that's it for the talk.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Beth. So for everyone listening, I'd encourage you to take this moment to type any questions into the chat. And maybe in the meantime, Beth, I could ask one question. You said, obviously, Kaga has the helpline for authors who have questions about open access, and you take turns manning that. I'm wondering what the most common questions or concerns are that you end up out from authors.
Sometimes, I guess, one thing is that they're not clear what different open access types mean. If they're submitting to a journal with green open access policies, or if it's gold open access. They're also, we do have queries about APCs, if they're eligible for a discount or to have the APC waived. So that's common. Or sometimes it's just a technical thing too, even with the submission system. They can't get back to the page where they want to change something, that kind of thing. And sometimes we also have questions from libraries as well, who are active in open access and in supporting authors in publishing. And sometimes we've had some questions about DOAJ. There are some institutions that will cover APCs for authors, but only if the journal that they are submitting to is listed in Directory of Open Access Journals.
Right. Okay, thank you. And we've had one question come through. Can you talk a bit about Platinum Open Access? Where is this opportunity and its future? So I guess, could we start with what is Platinum Open Access? I had this discussion the other day trying to spot the difference between Diamond and Platinum.
I don't think there is a difference, actually. So originally, it was referred to as Platinum Open Access. And then, I don't know, someone decided it should be called Diamond Open Access, and it has gradually shifted. So, but they mean the same. And this is such a good example of what I said. There's a listserv around open access topics. And for like the last 3 weeks, there have been like dozens and dozens of articles about what, like if it should be Platinum or Diamond Open Access and what it really means. So this is a very good question, but also like all questions are good. If anything doesn't seem clear in open access, it's probably not clear to a lot of people. But so yeah, Diamond Open Access or Platinum Open Access, I mean, it's fantastic thing because then the costs are covered for reading. So it gives everybody access to reading, and also it doesn't prevent authors from participating in the global scholarly communications because the costs of publishing are covered too.
So who normally covers the costs under this model?
Yeah, I think that's the hard part. So yeah, because a lot of institutions that could cover the costs also don't have the funding, and there's been some debate. So there are some parts of the world where they've been doing it, like in Latin America especially. People tend to point to that. They have a really strong tradition of platinum or diamond open access. That's very successful. Local institutions cover it. But it also depends, I think often where it works, there are volunteers involved, and that's not always possible. Sometimes more is expected of the authors or people in that community to take on more work. And we know that authors are already much too busy. Researchers have far too many responsibilities often as it is to say, okay, well, we'll publish a journal at our university and everybody can volunteer some time to, make sure it runs. And so that's not necessarily feasible. And when you have a journal, you do want it to be sustainable. It's really a lot of work. Like it's, I think when there was a transition from like print to internet, there was this idea that, it must have been like paying the mail services and the paper that cost so much. And once you put it online, that will be easy and free. But that's so far from how it is because you need to invest in like research integrity checks and peer review systems and the dissemination. Like usually a publisher takes on the task of making sure journals are current and listed in all of the databases like Scopus or the Clarivet services or PubMed, so that the papers can be found and read, and all kinds of other things. So yes, diamond or platinum open access would be fantastic. We have a handful of these journals, and we call them partner publications, and they're with, for example, like a Ministry of Health or with the Society. But in some cases, a lot of other communities also, resources are very limited and they might not be able to invest in it, and not for the long term. Some projects also, they might get a grant for like 3 or 5 years, but then what happens then? It's very difficult if you want to have a journal with a strong community, and you want it there for the long term. And if you don't know how you can fund it in 3 years.
So just from my understanding, is it fair to say then that gold open access is really when an author pays the open access fees, maybe through their funding, and platinum is not to do with the single article, but platinum is to do with creating a journal, and that journal has its fees paid or volunteered, but for the author there's no charge. Is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it's still not clear, but where the opportunity is in its future, it's still not clear how it will feature in the future because it's heavily dependent still on funding.
I do think it will grow because there's a lot of interest now and there's momentum, but whether it can grow to a point where it sort of replaces the other models, I think that would be quite difficult.
Okay, well that actually takes us nearly up to the hour, and so it falls to me to say thank you very much, Beth, for being here, taking the time and sharing your expertise on what is actually a incredibly complicated topic. Even for somebody who works in publishing, I still seem to find some kind of new mineral or precious stone that's been a form of open access has been named after that I didn't know about.
Oh yeah. Oh, you should just look at those listservs sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone very much for your attention. We hope that you've taken away something valuable from the webinar, and do check out the slides it will send. Some of the links there will be very useful, and if you don't need them today, perhaps you'll need them again in the coming months or even years. The things like the Sherpa links and Kaga's open access links, they will remain valid, and when the choice comes to decide on an open access license, we hope you'll remember that you have those resources. So in that case, wish everyone a great rest of the afternoon or rest of the morning, depending on where you are, and see you at the next campus webinar.
Thank you so much. Bye.